Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Philip Bloom. I'm the curator of the Chinese Garden and the director of the Center for East Asian Garden Studies at the Huntington. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's talk by Dr. Lorraine Wilcox. Thank you all very much for being here, and I'd like to express my particular thanks to the Carol, Edward, Ariana, and Joseph Wong Trust, and to the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund for supporting our lecture series this academic year. Before we begin, please turn off or turn to silent mode any noise-making devices that you might have, and please also take note of the emergency exits that are marked in red. I'd like to frame today's talk by providing a little bit of context for our lecture series as a whole this year. I know a lot of you have heard this before, but I think if you haven't been to any of our previous lectures, it might be useful for you. As many of you know, excuse me, last spring, the Huntington opened the Caiyaopu, which is literally the plot for picking medicines. This is a small section of our Chinese garden that's dedicated to the cultivation of Chinese medicinal plants. And fundamentally, we wanted to create this medicinal garden as a site for considering the many relationships that people have had with plants since time immemorial. These are relationships that are at once universal and culturally specific. The garden itself is a home to a collection of about 120 species of plants, each of which plays an important role in Chinese medicine, past and or present. The plants have been divided into a series of beds that exemplify some of the ways that people in China, and to a certain extent throughout the world, use and think about flora. The core of the garden is 3 beds that are devoted to fundamental herbs, that is, Chinese plants that have been used medicinally for at least 2,000 years. One of the beds showcases imported plants, herbs that were imported from India, Central Asia, and even America, and that became part of the Chinese pharmacopoeia through centuries of trade. Another highlights common foodstuffs that are also medicinal. These include things like ginger or silk gourd or garlic chives. A third foregrounds medicinal plants that have other practical uses as dyes, as pigments, as oils, etc. The general landscaping of the garden points to the medicinal functions even of common ornamentals like chrysanthemums or peonies. And most importantly, we have a final bed that gestures toward the broader philosophical framework that is specific to Chinese herbal medicine. This bed includes plants that represent the 5 flavors by which pharmaceuticals are categorized. These flavors, in turn, are correlated to the 5 phases, which are cycles of generative and destructive energy that are thought to govern how the cosmos works. Collectively, these beds tell a story about people and plants that's at once universal and specific. Humans everywhere have always made use of plants as medicines, as foods, as dyes, and as ornamentals. But it's really only in China that plants have become part of this particular correlative cosmology that describes the relationships among all things in the world. To me, this simultaneous universality and specificity is really what makes the Chinese medicinal garden so meaningful. I also think the garden is meaningful in that it's really one of the sites in the Huntington where you can see how creatively people have approached plants and how creatively they have determined their uses and also tried to figure out how plants fit into the way nature works as a whole. To help elucidate some of the themes that I've just outlined, but also more generally to celebrate the opening of the medicinal garden last spring, we decided to devote this year's Center for East Asian Garden Studies lecture series to Chinese medicinal plants. When we were conceiving the Caiyaopu, we discussed a number of possible themes for our beds. At one time, I at least had really hoped that we could plant a lot of the collection in pots so that we could create sort of spontaneous groupings according to whatever themes we came up with. But horticulturally, that didn't work out so well. But among the themes we had hoped to highlight was women's medicines, which will be the focus of today's talk by Dr. Lorraine Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox is both a practitioner and a scholar of Chinese medicine. She received her degrees from Samurai University of Oriental Medicine and the American University of Complementary Medicine. She now teaches at Alhambra Medical University and Emperor's College of Oriental Medicine. Her clinical and scholarly work both focused first on acupuncture and Moxibustion. And in fact, I think she really began her work as a doctor of Chinese medicine by offering acupuncture at the Jeffrey Goodman Special Care Clinic, which focuses on the treatment of people with HIV and AIDS. She continues to teach the history, theory, and practice of acupuncture and Moxibustion today, but she also teaches courses on everything from channel theory to feng shui and the I Ching. Complementary to her practice, Dr. Wilcox became increasingly interested in reconstructing the worldviews of the historical Chinese physicians who developed the techniques that she was, at least to some degree, still using today. And consequently, she began actually translating a number of historical medical treatises and case records. And she's really made, I think, a remarkable effort to try to inhabit the mindset of physicians in the Ming and Qing dynasties. The many works that she's translated in the course of her research have been published in places like the Journal of Chinese Medicine, the Chinese Medicine Database, and the Lantern. She also has a YouTube channel where she's documented some of her own experiments with recreating historical prescriptions and techniques, which is also something that she's done in many of her classes. In the past several years, really I think the past decade, Dr. Wilcox has turned increasingly to researching women doctors and women's medicine, work that's at the heart of her talk today, 3 women doctors of late imperial China. At the end of Dr. Wilcox's talk, we'll open to questions from you in the audience. If you're watching online, please feel free to post your questions into the chat box, and I'll try to pose them to Dr. Wilcox myself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lorraine Wilcox.
Wow, that's bright. So hi, humans. It's good to be here. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for the Huntington for inviting me. And since this is a short lecture, I'm just going to start going. So, you know, if you go to school and you take a history class, like all the history they talk about is male doctors writing books in, you know, medical texts and so forth. So I was kind of surprised when, you know, more than a decade ago, a scholar named Charlotte Firth, you know, told me that about Tan Yunxian's book. And so Tan Yunxian wrote, you can see her dates up here. She wrote a book that in English I've been calling Miscellaneous Records of a Female Doctor. And, you know, so Charlotte gave me a copy of, you know, a Xerox copy of like photos of each page of the book because it hadn't been published at all. And it sat in my closet for a long time. And one time I was just really bored and looking for something to translate because that's what I do for fun. And so I pulled it out and I had to type up the Chinese because there was no electronic copy and started translating, and I just fell in love with Dr. Tan. So, you know, I kept translating and then eventually it got published. So she, you know, how does a woman become a doctor back in Imperial China? These 3 women have different stories of how it happened, but Tan's paternal grandparents were both doctors, her grandmother as well as her grandfather, and her, you know, the males in the family below that, none of them wanted to be a doctor. They wanted to be scholars. They wanted to be government officials, which is higher status. And so just kind of, it sounds like on a whim, her grandfather said, let's teach her our medicine. And so she, you know, she was literate, she read all the same books that male doctors would read, and while she doesn't specifically talk about interning with her grandparents, but I'm sure she must have. One thing that we should understand is, you know, a lot of people want to say, oh, it's a gynecology text. That is not true, because she treated anything, she was like a general practitioner for women. all of her patients were women, and many of the cases were skin conditions or insomnia or poor digestion, as well as gynecology and obstetrics kind of stuff. She wasn't a midwife, though. She wasn't helping babies be born, but she treated everything that women had. You probably are aware that there was a lot of separation between the sexes, and so it must have been even more uncomfortable than it is today for a woman to see a male doctor. And so apparently she got very popular because all the women in her neighborhood just really were more comfortable with a woman doctor. So anyway, I translated this book, and it was published in 2015, I think. Anyway, so one of the amazing things, though, about it is that the book was almost totally lost and no copies existed. It had 2 printings. In the first printing, there's not one copy that anyone knows in existence. The second edition was published by her great-grandnephew, and there was only one known copy of that in a rare books library in Beijing. So I was really fortunate to get a copy of the text because it wasn't easily available. So instead of talking more background, I just want to give you some of Tan's description of her own experience. In her introduction, she tells her story, and one of the things I like about case study books is it tells the women's stories that she's treating, but she also, in her introduction, kind of told her own story. So she says that before she was married, when she was still a kid, she waited on her father, and, he'd sit there drinking and, ask her to recite the poetry that children would memorize. And she would recite passages from books on how females are supposed to behave. But the grandfather at some point said, wow, she's really smart. She can do more than just embroidery. And so they decided to teach her medicine. And so she says, this is kind of like a 4-stage thing. She says, at that time I was able to memorize these texts, but I didn't understand what the words really meant, because she was just a kid. Later, then, she started reading medical texts, and apparently she kind of fell in love with it, so she was reading these texts constantly, and when she could, she would ask her grandmother for guidance. Even though the grandfather said, let's teach her medicine, the grandmother was really her teacher. The grandmother was also a doctor, which is interesting. Anyway, so, she'd ask her grandmother questions, and her grandmother would explain, and then she, could understand these explanations. And so stage 2, this is when I understood the value of the words, but I'd never tested them. She had no clinical experience. Okay. And then when she was 15, she was married, which was common in those days. But she was sick a lot, diseases of blood and qi. We don't know exactly what disease, but she was sick. And so a doctor would come and prescribe for her, but she'd try to diagnose herself in advance. And then when she received the herbs, she'd look through them and decide, okay, this herb is good for me, but I'm taking that herb out of that formula. So she was, still working on medicine even when she was newly married and still teenage. Eventually, she gave birth to 3 girls and 1 boy, and when they were sick, instead of calling the doctor, she would write a formula and then check with her grandmother. This is part of her internship, and this was when I tested the medicine a little, but I did not yet understand how effective it was. So that's like stage 3. And finally, this is, kind of the more emotional part. When her grandmother was dying, she was very close to her grandmother. The grandmother gave her all her medical books, which some of them may have been printed books and some of them may be her handwritten notes and so forth, and also the tools for making medicine. And she said, if you memorize this, I can die content. And so she was like really sad and overcome with grief and became sick. Probably it's kind of implied as a result of the grief of her grandmother passing. And so she had some illness that she was sick for more than 7 months. And in fact, she was so sick that her mother had started planning her funeral. In case you don't know, this, it sounds weird to me as a Westerner, but in China in the past, people often, bought coffins well in advance for, their loved ones, and that was considered like filial piety and everything. So, but she must have been pretty sick if they were planning her funeral. But she was, semi-conscious, and she dreamed, and her grandmother came to her in a dream and said, "Your disease is not fatal. The formula is in such and such a book on whatever page, and you have to treat yourself according to that formula, and you'll recover within a few days. And in fact, you can live 73 years. And in fact, she lived into her 90s. Your practice will be even more skilled than mine was, the grandmother says to her, and you can help relieve people's suffering." And so she woke up, like startled awake, and she made herself get out of bed, and she found the book, and she found the formula, and she took it, and that is when I understood how effective this medicine was. And then after that, I'm sure she started small, treating people in her household, but little by little, word of mouth got out that there's this woman doctor who's really great, and people started, knocking on her door and asking for treatment and so forth. So that's her story. This is the earliest medical text written by a woman in China that we have. I mean, there's some other books that are named, but they're lost. We don't have. So this is the earliest medical text authored by a woman. I think some of you may know that Lisa C. wrote a novel about Tan Yunxian. If you read it, you have to remember it's fiction, but in the postscript, Lisa C. really explains what is real and what is not real in that book. It's fiction, but it's fun. It's a really nice read. So, if you're interested in reading about a woman doctor such as this in the Ming Dynasty, then that's, a book you could try. There's also a Chinese TV series that uses her name, but it's totally, not her. Yeah, because it takes place in the Imperial Palace, and she never went to the Imperial Palace, or at least if she did, she didn't write it in her book. So it's just, they took her name and that she was a doctor, and then they put her in a totally different place, and I'm sure there's romance with princes and, whatever. Right? But it might be fun to watch, but kind of having translated her book ruins some of, the nonsense for me that I might have enjoyed if I didn't know anything about her otherwise. Okay, so that's Tan Yunxian. It's 31 cases, and one of the things I really love about her is she's constantly asking the women, what do you think caused this? And then the woman will say, my husband wants to take on a concubine because I can't give him a son. And you can feel the heartbreak. And then she got sick, or something like that. Not Tan, this is her patients. But what I really like is you get some of the patients' stories as well as her own. And she treated noble women, and she treated poor people. One of her cases is about, there's a woman there's a big lake near, she's from, what's it called, Yangtze? No? Sorry, I can't remember her city, but there's like a big lake there, and so people get around on boats, and there was a boat woman who had arthritis in her hands because she was exposed to wind and rain and cold, with her work boating. And, so you can tell that she's treating like people from all economic classes, which is another thing I like about her. So that's the first of these 3 doctors and how she became, a practitioner. The second one, her name is Gu Dehua, and this has been my project since like September. In September, somebody mentioned Gu Dehua has a book that's still in existence, and like I said, what? I want to see that. So I eventually, I found it online. I found a print copy of it, and I started translating it. And so this book is probably going to be out before the end of the year. It's, in the editing process and so forth. So in any case, then Gu Dehua, you can see, we don't know her exact dates. She was probably born in something like 1816 or 1815, from a little bit of detective work about some of the dates in her book. But basically she's 19th century, and she wrote a book called Medical Cases from the Flower Charm Studio, which the Flower Charm Studio was, likely the place where she wrote and where she saw patients. It was probably on her family's compound or maybe on her husband's compound. And so, again, it's, a story of like, her family wasn't really high-ranking, but they were local government officials. They were all literate, and so they enjoyed the kinds of things that government officials and literate people enjoy, like writing poetry and cultivating flowers. And the father was famous for cultivating plum blossoms that he'd give to the temple for certain festivals, and all this kind of stuff. There is, it's claimed that there's a long medical tradition in her family, but that's not documented. She and her brother, who was also a doctor, were the first people in the family that we know for sure were doctors, but then there's a claim that it's like, I don't know how many, 37 generations or something like that of doctors, but no documentation. And so as a teenager, she wrote poetry, and she was published. She was published in a collection of poems, and she was also, she had her own book of poetry. The collection of poems still exists, so there's 7 poems that she wrote that, are in existence, but her own book of poetry seems to be lost. Okay. So again, what kind of interests me and what I want to talk about is, how did a woman become a doctor back at that time? And so she told her own story in a preface again. So when she was 16, which was 1832, she was sick with an epidemic disease. So at this point, epidemics have passed through all over the world, periodically, but this, the 19th century in China, there were a lot of epidemics going through, and it was a time when there were new theories about treating epidemics. If some of you have medical background, Wenbing theory had just developed fairly recently before this, and so, there were so many epidemics, and everybody's really scared because people die. So many people die when an epidemic passes through. And so she had some kind of epidemic disease when she was 16. And even though doctors prescribed formulas for her, none of it worked. And so she had even gone into, unconsciousness and had convulsions and, really, really sick. She was sick for a month when she kind of, prayed all night long. And what she actually prayed for? She prayed that she wouldn't die because she didn't want her parents to be sad. She's got a lot of filial stuff in, her text. You'll see more later. So, she prayed, to survive so her parents wouldn't have that loss. And eventually she fell into a sleep and she had a dream. So here is her explaining her dream. I dreamed that I arrived at a tower with stone stairs rising into the sky. I went up 3 winding flights of stairs. It was cleaner than anything I had ever seen. A man wearing a green cloak called my name and said, "There's a magic pill to save you. It's up on the top floor." And I immediately knocked my head on the ground in thanks and asked, "Oh, but can you give me the pill for my parents?" And the doctor in her dream, the figure in her dream says, "Yeah, sure." So she's walking up the stairs when her grandfather comes to check on her and woke her up. And so I guess she and her parents didn't get the pill. But she's still sick. Her fever continued and her consciousness was going in and out. She was having fever dreams, and then she saw someone dressed in black robes and a silk hat. He used a bowl of cool water to wash the crown of my head, and he advised me to change doctors. Suddenly, the coolness from washing her head penetrated into her heart and her spleen, and then she woke up. And so she told her parents this dream, and then they switched doctors, because the person in the dream says, "You need to switch doctors." And she recovered. So once she was better, she, quote, "abandoned embroidery and spent the time reading formula books." So just like Tan Yunxian, her parents said, "Oh, she shouldn't do embroidery," her grandparents, "she should study medicine." Here's another case where they're using that kind of image to say, she can do more than just the typical girl stuff. Okay? So she recovers. And, she's still writing poetry. And the next year, though, her father became ill with a lung disease that the doctor said, "Oh, this is incurable. He's going to die." And so she nursed him for a year, but all the time she kept reading medical books. So maybe she was reading them to keep herself busy. Maybe she was reading them to find solutions for her father. But, she just kept reading medical books. And eventually, a year later or so, he began to recover. And so now she had some medical background, both maybe after her own illness and also taking care of her father. But she still didn't want to be a doctor. She wanted to write poetry, and she was studying with a poetry teacher. It's a bit interesting because, she had a male poetry teacher who was friends with the family, but he was still a male teacher. And, back then there was a lot of separation of the sexes, and she did a lot of she was literate. Not every educated family would educate their daughters. And so it seems like she had more freedom than some women at the time. But here's a really weird thing. So her poetry teacher was this person, Wei Junqiu, and he wrote a couple paragraphs of biography about her. And so he's talking about when the father had the lung abscess. He said, her father had lung abscess and recovered when she cut off some flesh from her thigh. So you need background on this, okay? I think most of you probably haven't heard about that from medicine. It's, called Gegu. And this is a thing that had been going on since the Qing Dynasty, where when somebody you cared about was extremely ill and maybe you thought they might die, you would make medicine by cutting off a bit of your flesh and putting it in with the herbs to cook. And that was supposed to be, probably there were some karma points for doing that. It wasn't, but also, it was supposed to be extremely nourishing for the really sick person. The original story is there were poor people, and the mother was sick, and the mother asked for meat, and the family was too poor to buy meat, so the son in the Qing Dynasty cut off a bit of his flesh and cooked it for her, and I don't remember if she got better or not. But ever since then, there are a number of stories in the history of China. I'm not talking Chinese medicine, but just stories of extremely filial daughters or wives or, daughters-in-law who did this kind of thing. But I am not 100% convinced that this actually happened. I have some suspicion that he may have been using this as a metaphor. I mean, she spent a whole year caring for her father, and, she was just the most filial daughter in so many ways. So maybe he was saying this just like kind of using it as like a saying or a metaphor to just say how wonderfully she took care of her father, or maybe it's true, but she didn't write about it in her preface. She wrote about her father being sick, but she didn't write about, giving him some of her own flesh. Anyway, I guess I love my parents, but not that much. Right? I don't want my daughter doing that for me. Okay. So, we're still working on how did she become a daughter. In 1840, she began coughing up blood. So maybe it's tuberculosis, but there are other diseases that could cause coughing up blood. And so she had heard of a doctor in a nearby town, a Dr. Li, and it was too far, I guess, to commute for treatments. And so she and her husband her husband was a doctor too, or an aspiring doctor. And she rented a place, with the neighbor next door to this doctor who was treating her. And so, to while away the time while she was just recuperating in this place, she was writing poetry, and apparently the poetry was about being homesick and wishing she could be back home with her family. And the doctor, Dr. Li, he came in and said, it doesn't rhyme, but you can see four characters. It's really kind of nice in Chinese, I think. He told her, if your state of mind is not empty, it's hard for medicine to cure. That's probably good advice, calm yourself, empty yourself, and maybe the medicine will work better. So her husband was living with her for about a year or two in this place, and this Dr. Li made them listen to lectures on medicine. Probably, he specialized in Yangsheng, or nourishing life, which is doing things to promote health, which is not the same as doing things to treat disease. So he was, I'm sure, treating her disease, but also giving lectures about, promoting one's own health. And after a while, they asked to be his students. They stayed there, the husband and wife, and studied for a certain period of time, and eventually they were ready to go back home. And he commanded her to help the poor and sick, but she didn't have confidence. There are a number of things in her biography where she doesn't quite have confidence yet to treat. And so they went back home, and her husband was treating patients, but she wasn't really treating patients at first. She got forced into it, though. In 1842, so a year after she went home, she had a relative that had a case of malaria that was just lingering. It had been 6 months, and none of the doctors had been able to help her or cure her. And so the family, said, what do we have to lose? Dr. Gu, come treat this person. And so, again, from her poetry teacher's biography, here he explains the situation. He says, the superintendent of Imperial silk manufacturing, so her husband's like some, important person, whatever. He insisted on inviting Dr. Gu to treat his wife. She couldn't turn it down, I think, for social pressure, or because he was like a high position. She couldn't say no, so she went and checked with the wife and gave a prescription, and the woman, was quickly cured. And so after that, then the superintendent was telling all of his family and friends, this woman, she's a good doctor. And then everybody was asking her, suddenly everybody was knocking on her door to treat them, including males. There is evidence that she mainly treated female patients, but she did treat some males. So again, he says she felt she couldn't refuse them. He goes on to say she's not like some of those doctors who brag about everything, you know, she's very modest, he says. And so the last little story about her is that, again, this was a time when there were epidemics and people would die. There were all kinds of things that went around. And so the wife of somebody asked me to treat him. This is Dr. Gu talking. And she said he was in a critical case from cold damage. So I know not everyone knows what that is, but that's like, you know, external wind and cold invade the body, but it's progressed until he was critically ill. You know, you could get, like if you have common cold, it can turn into pneumonia and, you know, susceptible people might die. So he's critically ill, and she thinks this is from the invasion of wind and cold, which is not considered contagious. But epidemics are contagious. They knew epidemics, you know, could be transmitted from person to person. So if it's just cold damage, she doesn't have to worry too much. And so she went to see him, but when she arrived there, she realized that it was what is likely to be today's scarlet fever. And I checked in the West, because I didn't find statistics for China, but before antibiotics, 20% of the people who had scarlet fever died from it. You know, I mean, that's not just some mild childhood disease. You know, people die from scarlet fever, and she was afraid. She urgently wanted to return home, but the patient's family pulled on my clothing and begged me to stay. They just were desperate for help, and so she had no alternative but to try. I don't know if it was because she felt empathy or because she felt socially she couldn't say no, but yeah, she felt obligated. Again, here's her reluctance to, you know, treat patients. Anyway, she examined him and returned home to write a formula. And she knew all the other doctors were exhausted because this epidemic had been going around and so forth. And so she drew up a formula with a large dose of herbs. And then the next morning they called her again, and the patient was suddenly so much better. So, you know, she treated a bunch of serious cases. She also treated stuff that wasn't so serious. She has, I think, 29 cases in her book. And in her book, many of them are like, you know, here's the first treatment, here's the second treatment, here's the third treatment. So one case has 15 treatments in a series on one patient. Other cases might be just one treatment or 5 treatments. So we can really follow the patient through time. And yeah, some of them were really serious conditions. So I was saying to someone at lunch, you know, this here must have been like at the beginning of AIDS when doctors had to treat patients and they didn't, you know, they knew it could be deadly, but, you know, they still were brave enough to do it, even facing their fears, or at the beginning of COVID, you know. So doctors really are brave, some of them. The third and final doctor I want to talk about is someone named Zheng Yi. And you can see she's much later. She's at the end of the Qing Dynasty and the beginning of the Republic of China. And she wrote a book called Collection from the House of Ancient Happiness. You might detect from the previous one that people often name books after the place where they lived or the place where they wrote. And so that was published in 1907, which was still the tail end of the Qing Dynasty. This is an actual picture of her. It's in her book, and her book is only in Chinese, and I've translated bits and pieces of it, but I haven't yet worked on, you know, translating it. This book actually is a little bit strange. The first 2 volumes are poetry, again, another poet. The second 2 volumes are medicine, and the last 2 volumes, one is on women's education, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the other is on cooking and food preservation so that young housewives will know how to be frugal and yet have nutritious food for their family. I have translated the cookbook. Some of it we could do, some of it maybe not so much. So This is not a case study book. The first two books were case studies. This one, though, is like, how do you treat this? How do you treat that? How do you treat the next thing? But occasionally she inserts something that happened in her life. And so I tried to capture those for this slideshow. She says, I remember as a child my older brothers and their friends returning home after class every evening. They had no limits. They caught butterflies and looked for flowers. They had unrestrained pleasure just running around like kids. But because I have bound feet, I was aware of the heavy weight, I was aware of the heavy weight my body carried with feet like shackles. Even touching them made me cry. The suffering from this situation is unimaginable. So, you know, she was in this anti-foot binding movement that was developing at this time. In the medical volumes, there's a preface that she wrote telling how she became a doctor. She said, because my father died when I was young, my mother took us to live in his hometown, which was in, I think, Sichuan. My family's collection of medical books was very complete, so in my spare time, I browsed through them and I secretly became fond of medicine. She never had a teacher, she just studied from these books. Here's a story someplace else in it. My older sister was constitutionally thin and weak. The third time she was giving birth was difficult, and she even lost consciousness when the baby was born. They poured in a formula that's called Shenghua Tang, which is a common formula for immediate postpartum period. It nourishes blood, because you lose blood giving birth, and it also helps move blood because there's often blood stasis. The blood isn't moving well after you give birth, and it's also a warming formula because there's, a dislike of cold in Chinese culture, and it's thought that it's easy for cold to invade, from below because you're pretty open after you give birth. They poured in this formula, Shenghua Tang. Poured in means that she's like not really conscious and she can't just drink the formula, so they're dripping it in bit by bit, trying not to choke her on the liquid, but, it's dribbling down her throat. But it was ineffective. And at the time, I was attending to her medicine. What she means by that is she was cooking the herbs, and, if she needed to take it how many times a day, she would bring the herbs, and so forth. So I sneaked out and checked the medical books, and I was very confident that this was not a blood issue, this was a qi issue. Because Shenghua Tang really deals with blood, it doesn't deal with qi. So I then secretly poured a half a cup of condensed ginseng decoction into the second boiling of the formula and had her take it. So a package of herbs is often boiled twice or maybe even 3 times. So this first time it wasn't doing anything. The second time she snuck in what she thought was the right herb, and apparently it was, because she revived after that. But, she was like a teenager then, and who was she to go against the doctor? So she did this sneakily. She wasn't a teenager, but at the time she was 20 and she hadn't married yet. And she never told anybody because she wasn't supposed to have done that, even though it worked out well. How could I have known that my sister would soon give birth to 2 more babies? And by the time she had a 6th baby, that's too many. By the time she had a 6th baby arrive, her qi and blood were even more depleted. So when that baby was born, then not only did she lose blood, but all her qi left with the blood, and she died. And so she says, at that time I had married and gone to Fujian, so I never saw her again. She wasn't there to kind of influence the formula. Until today, I think of her and deeply regret this. So now I'm writing this section of the book to record what happened, hoping that it won't happen to any of you who read this, because you have my experience now. So, she felt if she had been treating her sister would have survived. So that's kind of a sad story. Okay. This is a preface written by, somebody who was important at the time, a man who was important at the time. You ask people to write a preface for you, so he wrote a preface. And he said Zheng Yi, Lady Zheng, was concerned about the critical situation in China at the time. If you know anything about this, this is the end of the Qing Dynasty when everything's falling apart. And part of why it's falling apart is because the US, Japan, and many European nations were all putting pressure on China, and there were opium wars, and there was, all kinds of turmoil going on. So no wonder she's concerned about the critical situation at the time. But she feared that women's education would not be supported. So she abandoned poetry, calligraphy, and painting, thinking they were of no real use. And she made herself a model of women's education, and so she wrote 2 volumes on women's education. So, she was kind of a crusader for women's rights, but actually, on the next slide, we'll see that she wasn't quite as radical as you might think from this. But she thought it was better to do stuff for her country than to just do poetry and calligraphy and stuff like that. So she says that this is from her writing on women's education. When women are married, they become the female master of the household, which is another way of saying housewife, but they're in charge of all the stuff inside. And that's connected to the security of the family. Therefore, if you want to be a strong country, you have to strengthen your own race. She's not using race the way we use it in the US today, but she means the Han Chinese people and not all the, the Americans and Europeans and the Manchurians and the, all the people who are trying to put pressure on China. So if you want the whole country's race to be strong, you must begin with your own household's health-promoting practices. The impact of health-promoting practices on the nation is extremely important. We should not only value health-promoting practices, like, she talks about hygiene in Western sense in her book, like hand washing and, stuff like that, but we should also study medicine. She's talking to women, so she's saying women should also study medicine. When we make the family strong, the country is strong, and when the country is strong, our race is strong. But what's actually happening here is she's saying women should study medicine, but they should stay home and just make sure they take care of the family. They shouldn't be out there working, as practitioners out in the world. But if you don't know medicine, when something goes wrong at home, you're a bit helpless. So, okay, maybe I'll work on translating her book. In any case, one thing, in doing research, and I've done a lot more research about other women doctors, although I haven't found texts that can be translated, but there were a lot more women doctors in the history of China, but they were just not talked about so much. And so I asked, how many women doctors were there that treated patients but never wrote books? I mean, there are tons of male doctors that treat patients and don't write books. Not every doctor writes books. So I'm sure there were other women doctors who didn't write books. And even for those who wrote books, how many of them, the books were lost? Like Tan Yunxian's book, there's only one known copy. And people would hand copy books, even though the printing press existed, but you might hand copy a book and somebody might copy it, but there might be only 10 copies in the whole world. And so, I think, the stereotype is that, women, excuse me, were not doctors. Certainly they weren't doctors as many as male doctors, but I have the feeling that there were a lot more than we realize in ancient China. So that's basically my talk. I think we're going to have questions soon, but I just wanted to really totally from my heart thank the Center for East Asian Garden Studies here at the Huntington, and Philip Bloom and Michelle Bailey have been so wonderful to me in setting this up and taking care of me here today and taking care of everything. And then my 2 friends, Ingrid Schneider and Jennifer Black, have been working in the Chinese garden for a long time and helping make it what it is and creating it. So, this is really a wonderful place, and I appreciate, all the kind people here, and I met other kind people today too. So that's pretty much it. So I think Thanks to you too. So I think we're having questions, but I can hardly see because of the lights, but there are microphones there, so if you have a question, please go to the microphone and hopefully I can hear you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox. If you all have questions, there are 2 microphones, one here and one on the opposite side of the room. Please just come up directly to the microphone and you can pose your question to Dr. Wilcox. Maybe I'll start, since I'm up here. I have a very specific question. So in the biography of Gu Dehua, she talks about the dream with the green-robed figure offering some kind of efficacious pill, and then she mentions a black-robed and black-hatted figure who washes her head with cool water. I wondered if you could unpack that. The fact that the colors and also just the language that they're using seems very specific, and I wondered if there's sort of more to unpack there in terms of what kind of cultural imaginary they're drawing on for that dream.
Actually, that's not something I've really researched. You're right. What is this green robe? Green is wood element, green is spring and liver, and does it have anything to do with that? I don't know. Or is there some cultural thing? But I've really focused on Chinese medicine, so some of the cultural images I don't really know. And black robes, who is that? I'm sorry, I don't have an answer. That's something that maybe I need to look for, is there some mythology surrounding that, or is that just a fever dream? I don't have an answer, sorry.
Please, there are 2 microphones, and the floor is everyone's.
Can I just ask questions from here?
Yes, if you speak
No,
loud.
we can't hear you. So if you could please come up to the microphone, that would be helpful for everyone else.
Look, if I can go in front of a mic, you can too. I'm so nervous. Not anymore.
I recently attended a seminar on the notable women in the Taoist tradition as medical doctors. Were these women Taoists?
It's a little muddy.
Oh, okay. So I recently attended a lecture on the notable women in Chinese medicine in the Taoist tradition.
Oh, okay.
Were they Taoists, these women that you mentioned today?
So, first off, Chinese didn't feel compelled to be one thing and not another. So often they did Taoist, Buddhist, and Confucian stuff all in the same household. Secondly, I don't know your conference, so I'm not saying anything about it, but a lot of people like to use the word Taoist for just, anything that's not Confucian. These women don't particularly, I think Gu Dehua seems kind of Confucian in her filial piety. There are other stories, there are other things where the filial piety is really emphasized, and that's a fairly Confucian value. There's no talk of these people, these 3 doctors, like meditating or doing rituals or anything like that. So certainly, pretty much everyone in China at the time had some influence from Taoism, I'm pretty sure, but I don't think they would have called themselves Taoist. Sometimes other people call that person, whatever person, Taoist, but I don't think they would have called themselves Taoist. I think Zheng Yi was too modern, and she had a lot of westernized thought. So she doesn't seem to be very Taoist. And Tan Yunxian, she doesn't really talk about it, but she just seems to exude compassion, so I wonder if she has some Buddhist background, but I didn't find any particular language that seemed very Buddhist or very Taoist or very anything.
I just wanted to give a little bit explanation when Philip Bloom asked about the color of the two agents. In the old say, the death of goddess has two agents, which is black and white. And when you're about to leave the earth, they come to get you. So the fact that they came, but they didn't get her because she had this experience of this cold water pouring on her, meaning her life has not ended on earth. So this is an enlightening moment of her not being taken away based on those culture of Chinese. So any of you can go look it up. Those are real stories that tell by ancient history about the death of goddess. Have a black agent and a white agent. When they come, then it's time to go. Okay?
Thank you so much. I'll be honest, it's really, I can hear you, but it's very muddy, so it's hard to hear all the words. But I appreciate your explaining the colors and of the things in her dream. Yeah, thank you so much. Hi.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Well, in your research, did they itemize what the formulas were for various treatments?
Oh, yeah. I didn't put the technical formulas in here because this is a general audience.
Oh, no, I understand. But, given the many herbs and everything that...
Yeah, they'd have, like, Gu Dehua had some pretty long formulas, and she'd give the dosage and how it's prepared, like honey fry this or stir fry that in vinegar, and, it's all there. And Tan Yunxian often named the formula because she was mostly using formulas from books that she'd modify. So she'd say, I used, Buzheng Tang, taking out this and adding that. So if you studied Chinese medicine, that's, you can decode what that means. Zheng Yi, it's not cases, and she does say, oh, if you have this condition, here's the formula for you, and she lists all the herbs and the dosage and how to prepare it, whether to make it in pills or decoction or, and so forth. There's a lot of that technical detail in all three of these books. In fact, so, I have Chinese medicine friends, some of them who know a lot more than I do, and one of these people who's just a total genius with Chinese herbs, and he's Chinese too, so he has a lot of the culture, he said that Gu Dehua, the second one of the three, that she is really going into such detail with the herbs and so specific, and he said he thinks that because she was a woman that she had to kind of like compete to make herself even more than the male doctors, so she was using all these fancy, instructions and stuff like that just to show she knew her stuff. That could be. I mean, I felt that sometimes. Not with herbal formulas, but, if there are guys that want to take over or something, like, yeah. I hope I'm not offending one with sexist stuff.
Hi, Lorraine. I'm actually one of your students at Yosan, and I just can't get enough of your teaching, so I drove all the way out here to take your lecture. And I'm just wondering, we already had an herb question, so maybe it's appropriate that I ask, what are some of the most common formulas and herbs that you saw that these female doctors were just prescribing over and over again? I think I heard you say one time that Tan Yunxian used, like about a quarter of the women would have sibutang prescribed to them, and I'm wondering what other common formulas that you would see over and over again between the three women that you saw prescribed.
So, the third one I haven't translated enough to really, comment on the third one, but Tan Yunxian was before Wenbing theory, the warm disease epidemic theory, and she used a lot of Zhu Danxi's formulas. Zhu Danxi was a famous doctor in the Yuan dynasty. He was called one of the four great masters of the Jin Yuan dynasties, and she quoted his writings and his formulas all the time. As far as, yeah, she did use a very famous formula for women, Su Tang, but always with modification. She never just used that, you know, plain. I'm not really remembering. Oh, she used Archen Tang, which is a formula against phlegm. You know, she used a lot of standard formulas, but she also used a lot of formulas that I had to try to look up and figure out what they were. The second one, Gu De Hua, used a lot of formulas from a book called Wenbing Qiaobian, which is this most famous book on, you know, warm epidemics invading, and she used a lot of formulas from that, but like she modified them, and she used other formulas when it wasn't an epidemic disease. One of the tricks, like she didn't always name the formula, she just wrote a bunch of herbs, and I had to try and figure out which formula is this based on, which formula is that based on, and she did use actually a lot of rhinoceros horn, which we can't use anymore, but that was used in treating febrile diseases, you know, high fever and stuff like that. You know, so it's when you're translating old books, some of the stuff is totally usable today, and some of the stuff it's like, we can't do that. So in selecting a book to translate, you kind of have to make sure that the percentage of what's usable is enough to make the book worthwhile, because if it's all stuff that nobody can use, then what good is translating that book? I don't know that I have a good answer for your question, but that's my train of thought.
Thank you for your presentation today. I'm curious about how these texts you referenced fit into the context of modern China. Would people studying the medicine today be aware of any of these?
I'm sorry, I hear you, but it's so muddy, it's hard to hear the words.
So I'm curious about the text that you referenced, all these books. Like, would people studying China today, would they be aware of any of these, or would they come across these in their studies?
Okay, so these books on women are not like everyday texts that everyone in China who practices medicine would know. These are rare texts, but I just recently was talking to somebody on the internet who's in, I think actually Singapore, but Chinese, and she said that like everybody's been talking about Gu De Hua's book lately, but it's kind of like women are more interested in finding like kind of a female medical lineage. You know, I don't know how, I mean, some men, of course, will be interested in the book for its history or for some of the medicine, but I think, you know, lots of women are longing for being heard and being seen and knowing that we've always been heard and seen. So, yeah, these are not like common popular books in China. Since there was a TV show about Tan Yunxian, I think her name became common, but that's like popular culture. You know, it's like a soap opera that has some medicine in it. Yeah, I certainly could translate more commonly used and more useful books, but like there are other people doing that, and I just kind of felt like I want these women to be heard. Was that what your question was? How? Yeah. Okay.
Hello here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the great lecture. So I have a question related how those female really took doctor as a kind of profession for them. Because it seems like those examples you gave, they're kind of from the noble families. And then medicine kind of like a hobby for them. And they were asked to treat those kind of patients. So I'm wondering, like, do you know how they really make life out of that? Do they like make money of that? Do they depend on doing doctor as a profession? And to more broadly, like, because in China, as we know, like a female doctor as a profession is kind of a long history, like long tradition since the Han Dynasty. So how do you say, like, do they really kind of more like a hobby or rather than a professional life? Thank you.
I'm sorry, it was hard to understand some of it. Is there someone closer who could just summarize the question?
Because the women are from noble families, I was wondering, was this a hobby or did they make a living from it?
Okay.
Thank you.
Actually, it's more clear if somebody yells than like. So, thank you. I think none of these women thought they would be a doctor when they were growing up. They thought they would just get married and have kids and write poetry because they were educated, and it's what educated women might do at the time. None of them really thought they would be a doctor, but their circumstances kind of pushed them into it, or they were exposed to it and found that they liked it. We saw Gu Dehua had she didn't really want to go out and practice, but she was forced into it because people were begging her, will you, treat my sick relative? And she felt bad for saying no, so she did it anyway. And Tan, she intended just to keep her medicine within her family and treat her children and maybe other family members, but apparently word of mouth got out. Some of her cases, Tan Yunxian, the Ming Dynasty one, some of her cases are like a maid. And so I imagine it was a maid in her own household. And then maybe the maid told another maid when they were at the market, and then, word started to get out and people started coming to her. But she didn't express any reluctance for practicing. She didn't put herself out there, she just did it, and then people started hearing of her. And we saw Zheng Yi didn't really want to practice professionally, she just wanted to keep her family healthy. She thought women should, stay in the inner quarters and stuff like that. So it seems like circumstances push these women out. And yeah, these were all highly educated upper class, which normally those women would not have a profession. Except taking care of stuff at home. Yeah.
There are several questions from people watching online. Two of the questions are about the relationships between doctors and midwives. You mentioned that Tan Yunxian specifically didn't deliver babies. So were most babies delivered by male doctors? Were there female midwives who were not doctors in China? What sorts of interactions were there between female doctors and midwives? And did female doctors have a different view of midwives than did male doctors?
Okay, so in the novel by Lisa C., Lisa has Tan Yunxian become friends with a midwife, but that was totally her creative, she needed to place the right people around Tan Yunxian to create her novel. There's no evidence that she had a midwife friend. So midwives get dirty, they get their hands dirty. They're touching, blood and other kinds of bodily products. Somebody who calls himself an E, which is doctor, the most that they really want to do is read the pulse. They don't want to be touching the patient a lot. And so if you call yourself a doctor, that means, midwives are much lower status. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just saying this is what was. And so they were, midwives were often illiterate. There's a Qing Dynasty book where somebody interviewed some midwives and wrote down a lot of their information. But generally midwives would be illiterate, they'd be highly skilled in delivering babies, at least you would hope they would be highly skilled. Some of them were, some of them maybe not so much. And they were just lower status and they got much more dirty doing their job.
Great, thank you. There's also a question about the idea of doctors sort of beginning their practice by healing themselves. Is that something that you see reflected in the Chinese medical literature?
I didn't hear the crucial part.
Doctors begin their practice by healing themselves. So doctor, heal yourself as a principle of kind of medical training. Is that something that you see in the Chinese medical literature that you've dealt with?
Is this about female doctors or just doctors?
Both, maybe.
Okay. So we saw with these two women that, the first two women, they had their own diseases and, they were healed. Gu Dehua, she had a dream that told her to get a different doctor. They got a different doctor and she was healed. Tan Yunxian had diseases of qi and blood and she got the prescription from her grandmother through a dream and so forth. So those two did end up healing themselves, and those two also, I think, having been sick and having been around sick people, like Gu Dehua, her father was sick and she tended to her father, inspired them to, study medicine more. But I don't think there's a general thing about doctors need to make themselves healthy before they can treat patients. There are quite a few stories in the history of Chinese medicine, I don't mean female, but, doctors in general, mostly male, where, the person was sick, sickly and did try to heal themselves, but there are also stories where the mother was sick and Li Dongyuan, another super famous doctor, his mother was sick and the doctors couldn't cure her, and he felt so bad afterwards that he studied medicine on his own in kind of as a filial piety thing, even though his mother was already gone. So there are so many stories of doctors who were inspired either by their own illness or by their somebody in their family's illness. It's a very common thing, but it's not a thing like where every doctor needs to, rectify their own health before they can treat patients. That's not a thing that I've ever come across in Chinese medicine. So is that it?
So, thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox, for your enlightening talk and for your really beautiful and useful translations. It was really a pleasure to read them and to hear you speak today. We have one more lecture in the Center for East Asian Garden Studies lecture series this year in 2 weeks on April 24th. We have an online lecture by Professor Vivienne Lowe of University College London. She's going to be speaking about the relationship between Chinese food and Chinese medicine. She's uniquely qualified to talk about that. Her research has been about the history of Chinese medicine, and her father and her sister are both quite famous Chinese chefs. So it should be a really interesting talk. It's online. You can register just as you registered for the talk today. So thank you, and thank you again so much, Dr. Wilcox.